A new national poll by the Associated Press shows that 85% of registered voters describe Americans as being greatly divided in their values. As political partisanship has grown, studies also show the number of intermarriages between people in different political parties is shrinking significantly. Our next guests ran an experiment on their dating podcast to get an inside look at this relationship phenomenon. Joining me now by Skype from San Francisco are the co-hosts of the Dateable podcast, Yue Xu and Julie Krafchick. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Yue, tell us about this mini dating experiment and why you decided to run it.
Well, Priya, it gets pretty juicy because we talk about deal breakers so much on our podcast. And a lot of people this year said a deal breaker for me is dating someone of opposing political beliefs. So we thought, well, that's a very strong statement. Let's put that to the test. Let's set out a blind dating experiment with two people who do have opposing political beliefs and see if romance can develop from that. So we reached out to Facebook groups, our own community, our own network, as well as, we went out there on social media to see who would be brave enough to partake.
And you did eventually find two daters, Kiki and Tom. Julie, tell us who they are, something about their backgrounds, and why you selected them.
Yeah, first and foremost, they were both single. They are in their 30s in New York City, and Kiki is more liberal, voting for Biden, where Tom is a registered Republican and either voting for Trump or Jorgensen. And the reason why we picked them was they were, first of all, well-versed in politics, so they could have a very educated, open conversation. They also found this experiment to be intriguing, so they really came in with a very open mind. They also had a lot in common outside of politics. Like, they both were in the arts, they both had similar values of what they were looking for in a partner, and similar lifestyles.
And Yue, did you find, as you were sifting through the different applications of people who came in, that there were any differences between Republicans and Democrats in their interest in dating across the aisle?
The Democrats were very triggered. We got more messages from Democrats who said, I would never partake in this. This is very triggering for me. I don't think I could go through with this experiment. But the Republican applicants were a lot more open. And they said, I've been wanting to have an open communication and conversation with someone from the Democratic Party. So they were much more open to it.
Julie, was that surprising to the two of you?
It was. And I think what I learned too is that people just make rash generalizations about the party, where in today's world, it may not even be Democrat versus Republican. It is whatever values that they have.
All right. Yue, how did bringing up politics change the dynamic of the date for Kiki and Tom?
The first half of the date, we told them no politics, so they can talk about anything but. But the second half of the date, as soon as politics were on the table, you felt the tension. And that was the word that both of them used in their post-date interview. They felt that uncomfortable tension come in because this is when it got real. This is when it got personal. But what was beautiful about this experiment was that by the end, they were able to find some sort of common ground and to openly hear each other out. So it wasn't a conflict or it wasn't a debate. It was more about let's find where we can find common ground.
All right. So I want to listen to a clip from the Zoom date that you set up for them. And this is one in which they talk about President Trump, and Kiki begins it. So let's listen in.
I think about, his rhetoric has been so aggressive. Like, to me, it just and his lack, I don't think he's been running things very well with the pandemic. All of these things to me feel almost like personal. You know what I mean? How do you feel about that opinion when you hear someone who feels like what he's doing is very personal and hurtful? Do you align with that? Do you have sympathy for that, compassion for that? And then how does that inform how you decide to move forward?
Yeah, I think I could start with the denouncing racism thing. He certainly could have, and I would argue should have, made a stronger statement than he did, like at that moment in the debate. But he speaks off the cuff, and his off-the-cuff remarks don't always come over very well even. I think my other counter to that is I think his bark is worse than his bite.
So Julie, how did this conversation continue to play out? Did it foster understanding or did it create more division between the two?
I think both daters walked away saying it was a good conversation. There wasn't a huge debate. There was that tension, as Yue mentioned. I think what we learned, though, was that everything else needs to be like 100% because this is still a big hurdle to overcome. And I think where Kiki was coming from is that she felt like a lot of this was personal and Tom couldn't fully understand.
Yue, for you, what were some of the takeaways from this experiment?
One big takeaway is, what if we approach politics like dating? These two people came on this date. You don't go on a date hoping the other person fails. You hope that they're a good match. So they came on the date trying to find common ground and trying to understand each other. We sometimes approach politics like a debate. We want the other party to fail, and we want to hear why they're so wrong and why we're so right. But in this experiment, you could see that they came in with such a positive, open mind that they were able to have more productive conversations.
Julie, do you feel the pandemic has shifted how people talk about politics? It seems like they're bringing it up earlier.
Absolutely. I think people are looking to get deeper quicker because we're not dating multiple people at once and we are potentially entering these more turbo relationships that move faster. So you want to know someone is aligned with you from a values perspective. I think, though, inevitably, this election is just so huge that it can't not come up on a date right now.
Yue, if you were to run this experiment again, is there something you'd do differently the next time around?
I think a couple things. I think we didn't have time on our side. If we had more time, I would love to space this out into 3-4 separate dates. So after each date, they have some time to just digest what was said and then come back nice and fresh. I think another thing is, what we really learned from this experiment is that we just have to go out and vote. So I wish there was more conversation that we would have brought in or prompted about voting, because it just shows you that politics is so personal, that Kiki felt like, I'm voting with my heart, I'm voting with my, what I've experienced, and Tom is very much about policy. So he's voting with what would benefit me from a political policy standpoint.
Julie, if you were to pull back a little bit and look at the scene broadly, how would you say that the hyperpartisanship of our electorate is being reflected in the dating pool, and what are the issues there?
Yeah, I think people are making blanket generalizations and potentially ruling out half the dating pool. And I think what I've learned from this is that it's not so black and white. It's not that all Republicans are X and all Democrats are Y. And I think people should look more at the individual. Of course, if their values do not align with you, that's one thing. But I'm going to look at it less about you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, and more about what you stand for individually.
Julie Krafchick and Yue Xu, thank you both so much, ladies.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you.